but it's a topic of morality, and that's a pretty general term, true? Morality is based in with our use of reason, and it's also based in our understanding of revelation. So I'd like to start by talking about the Beatitudes, because that is one of the foundations upon which we build our moral sense. And this is, I'm sure, familiar to all of you. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when men revile you and persecute you, and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. So that's a familiar statement about the ways to live. And it's filled with paradox. It's filled with irony. That it's not the way, I think, on the surface we think things are going to be. That blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek, blessed are the... they're blessings for what would be seen culturally as kind of the downside, in a sense. The people have reflected upon the Beatitudes, and some authors have talked about the fact that in some ways that they're almost a self-portrait of Jesus, because they describe the kind of qualities and characteristics and patterns that we see in his life. And so they provide for us a model, an example of the way to live. But what about our culture? One of the thing that is so prevalent that can affect all of us is that whole sense when it comes to morality that one opinion is as good as another. And so you might have your opinion about what is moral, I might have mine, you might have yours, and that's fine. And there may be very different opinions, but one is equal to the other. They're all of equal value. And because morality would be something that I believe is to be the case. And there's a fallacy in that. And that is, but there's a cultural sense that that's the case. That the whole thing that one opinion is as good as another. Now, in every other area of life, we don't hold to that. If you are a person who is undergoing surgery and you're going to have your appendix taken out, one opinion is not as good as the other, right? I mean, your next door neighbor might have an opinion about the best way to deal with it, and the neighbor on the other side might be a physician who might have an opinion. Well, one opinion is going to be superior. And it's not because that person is either better or worse, it's because that person is skilled in that particular area. And so that whole sense of one opinion is as good as another, we don't hold to that generally in most areas of life. But when it comes to morality, there is that sense that there is no right or wrong really. It's kind of up to me to be my own judge, to be my own, in a sense, my own God, with a little g. And there also is that sense out in the culture in which we live that, you know, if it feels okay, if it feels good, if it's okay. I mean, why is there a problem? So that there's so many different things out there that can affect our own mentality. And also the whole sense of morality and public policy. Should morality ever influence public policy?
It does in one way or another.
You think it should?
Well, it already does.
It already does. Is that good, bad, or different?
I think it's inevitable.
Is what?
It's inevitable. People
it?
have their own moral judgment.
Good, bad, or different?
It can be good.
It can be good. All right. All right. Yeah, and I think that's a good answer. Is that our morals, the way we behave, the way we relate, are ingrained into us, and so we use our sense of morality in order to establish public policy. So we have laws about theft. You know, I might feel like I would really love the television in your living room, but even though I feel like I really would like to have it, there's something immoral about that. And consequently, we have a law that if you go ahead and steal that, then you're going to be punished. There's a consequence. And that's a silly example, but there are examples across the board. Our whole sense of the growth and development in our culture in terms of race relations, certainly going back from the 50s and 60s to the present, that development has really been based in our sense of morality, that each person is created in the image of God and has rights and dignity and so on. And so it's wrong to be prejudiced, it's wrong to discriminate. So you can take it in a lot of different directions. But the culture can have an influence on us where it is insidious. It gets into our minds and bones. And that whole thing of things ultimately become more important than people. You know, it's the material that is superior as opposed to the spiritual, the relational. With that kind of a mindset that can infiltrate us, the whole direction of violence as opposed to peace, we see that played out every single day in the newspaper and on television. And the whole sense of our sense of morality being influenced by an individualistic sense, a materialistic sense, so that, again, what's important, I am the center of the universe, and in my opinion, is what matters the most. And if I'm stronger than you, I can force that upon you. I can control you. And so those kind of attitudes are so insidious that, and we hear that and then, well, I don't think that, but a variation of it can easily get into our mindset. And so all of this, these negative aspects in terms of living out the moral life is, we can see it in economics. The Pope has been speaking out more and more on inequality between peoples, between nations, between groups of people. The political systems can be oppressive and contrary to the gospel, and it goes on and on and on. Pope John Paul, back in the 90s, wrote an encyclical, The Gospel of Life. And in that encyclical, he has many notions of philosophy and theology, I think, that make so much sense as he speaks about it. And he talks about two different cultures, the culture of death, the culture of life. I think, unfortunately, politicians have gotten a hold of those two terms and used them for their own ends, politically. But the imagery there is I think, profound. That there is a culture of life that enhances the dignity of the human person and on all the different life issues. There's also the culture of death that militates against respect for the human person. And I think it's a good image to use, as long as it doesn't get swallowed up in the conflicts that we see played out politically over and over again. So moral principles, from the Catholic Church's point of view, moral principles, first of all, they're rooted in reason. And I've talked about that before, that we have a mind, we have the capacity to think, to analyze, to order, to try to figure things out. And so our moral principles, the Ten Commandments, can be discovered through reason, simply by the fact that as a human person, we know it's ingrained in us that somehow it's wrong to kill someone. Somehow it's wrong to steal from someone. Somehow it's wrong to be unfaithful to someone. Somehow we know that it's built into who we are with our reason. But also, from the Christian perspective, we have the fact that we are enlightened by revelation. We have God's Word. We have God's insight into who we are as persons. And we begin with the book of Genesis and go all the way to the book of Revelations. But in Genesis, it speaks so profoundly about as human persons, we are created in God's image. And what that means, more than anything else, is that we have the capacity to love. to choose, to think, to make decisions. That's who we are as human persons. And so moral principles from a Catholic perspective, they're rooted in reason, enlightened by the revelation we see in the Old Testament and the New Testament, but ultimately it is summed up in the life of Christ. So the focal point for the experience of morality, the focal point for any discussion of any kind of moral principles is the person of Jesus. And so that's key from a Christian perspective. So Pope John Paul speaks about that in this encyclical that I'm going to quote in different ways. But he has a basic principle that we are God's creature. And so just as if any of you artists that can paint, and if you are an artist and you have your masterpiece, your work, you can give us an insight by telling us what was in your heart, what was in your mind, what was the symbolism of it. The person who did this for us reflected upon her work, and she wrote it up. It's over there on the wall. And it's a beautiful description of what this, of interpretation of this from the author, from the one who made it. And so, if we look at this, we can somehow get an insight into the person that made it. That this obviously is a person that has a spirituality, a sense of peace, a sense of balance, all those kinds of things we can learn from looking at the one that created that. Well, that's all the more so with God. We can look at what God created. Here we are. We look at the beautiful sunrise, the beautiful sunset, whatever. We can see what our Creator has done. And as we reflect upon who we are, we connect ourselves back to our Creator, and that gives us a further insight into ourselves. Am I making any sense at all? Okay. And so what John Paul speaks about is that if we as human persons cut ourselves off from our Creator, if we eliminate God and tell God, well, you're probably pretty nice, but we don't need you. I'm going to live my life as if you're not around. Then we are cutting ourselves off from the one who has created us, who's the source, who has the information, who has the insight, who can tell us what we're about, can tell us where we've come from, and maybe more importantly, where we're going. And so our whole understanding of God is critical. So again, culturally, we hear so often that God is kind of God is dead. That was big back 30, 40 years ago. But today it's more God doesn't make any difference. We'll plug along without God. And which is, again, so fallacious and so harmful to ourselves and the dignity of who we are. So cut off from God, cut off from the sense of God, then that leaves us hobbled. It leaves us in a mess. And so the Catholic Church comes at all of this then and says, well, how do we know what's right and wrong? Where do we get our moral principles from? Is it, as sometimes we're accused of, that some people just kind of sit around a room and make up rules that everybody's expected to follow? Is that where morals come from? But rather, our understanding is morals spring from who we are as persons created in the image of God. And a key to that then is going back to the beginning, to our baptism. And with our baptism, we're incorporated into the life of Christ. And the scriptures say that when we are baptized, we're dead to sin and alive to God. And so when we are baptized, then we are, and we do it with an awareness and a sincerity and all of that, then we are connected to our God. Jesus himself is revealed as the way, the truth, and the life. And so if we think about what those words mean, that Jesus Christ is the way. So if we're faltering, we're trying to figure out what's right, what's wrong, what do we do? Well, it's not like we don't have any resources. It's a matter of, all right, what's the way? What's the path I take? Well, it's the person of Jesus and the implications of what that means. What is the truth in this situation? It's the person of Jesus. What does the Lord teach about this? What would that thing about the armbands a number of years ago, what would Jesus do? That's a pretty basic question, and it's valid. And then Jesus is the life that we all want to be alive. We all want to have happiness. We all want to be serene. We all want to have joy and excitement and enthusiasm in our lives. Where does that life come from? Well, it ultimately comes from God's goodness in our lives. And so, following the way, the truth, and the life, following Jesus, our understanding from the Catholic perspective and a moral perspective is that is what leads us to life. That's what gives us the capacity to be the people we're called to be. The opposite of that, to move away from the Lord and all that the Lord stands for, is to lead to the opposite of life, which in the end is death. But before we get to physical death, there are all sorts of ways that we die in terms of all the isms that are out there for us to fall into, all the issues that are there that can so conflict us and lead to our destruction. And so, in terms of the moral principles, where does the church come up with all of this? Well, ultimately, it's rooted in our understanding of what the Scriptures tell us, using our reason, what the Scriptures tell us, and who is Jesus? What does he say to us about all of this? The Beatitudes give us an insight into who the Lord is. In the windows of our church, we have the basic virtues. We have the cardinal virtues, and cardinal is a word in this sense that means hinge. It's the mechanism by which, it's the path by which we can live a decent life. Prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance. Those are four of the windows that we have on this side of the church, in the narthex, along with what we call the theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity. So those virtues then are key ways in which we come to discover what resources do I use in making a moral decision or avoiding an immoral. How do I know if it's moral or immoral? Well, look at the Beatitudes, look at Jesus, look at the virtues, look at the twofold commandment, love God, neighbor, self. Look at the Ten Commandments. Like mentioned, back several years ago, we were assessing our windows after we finished renovating the church and building the church. And we had them analyzed by two different firms, and the windows were, some of them were becoming corrupted because there was some kind of, I can't explain it to you, but there were issues in the windows. And so we told them, well, the last thing we want is a windstorm and have a window fall out on somebody. And so they said, well, that's not going to happen, but let's give you an analysis of which is the worst one and which is the best one. And you know what the worst one was the one with the devil. It really was. And the next one was gluttony. And I thought, I better get on the ball and lose some weight. But those were the two, and so they were the first ones we repaired, and then we've repaired 4 others since. But all the bad windows were on the sin side. It was very interesting. And on this side, they're okay. And so we've got a 4 or 5 year plan by which we'll get them all fixed up. But anyway, I thought I'd just mention that. But the first and last point of reference then is Jesus. And St. Paul says it. He says, to me to live is Christ. That is the way in which I live. And so all this being said, it really goes back to traditions as well, certainly, is the dignity of the human person. That each and every human person has dignity. Not because of anything they've done, not because of anything they haven't done, simply by the fact that they are created by God in God's image. And that is where our dignity comes from. And that being the case, then we have a responsibility, if we're following the way, the truth, and the life, is to respect the life of all other persons. So that gets us into all the life issues that are out there. Our conscience, we're given this gift by God, built in within us, within our heart, that helps us to know right from wrong. And so if we're trying to live a life that is in a good direction and we begin to stray, we experience guilt, true? I mean, I think we all know what that is. You know, there's something in us that says, this isn't right. You know? And then if you continue in the behavior, whatever it might be, it gets worse. This is awful. You know, and whereas the sin is enticing, it's attractive, but it's once you bite into whatever it might be, then you feel yourself being poisoned, and it's an image that can be used. And so our conscience is a gift from God that helps us to take all of what I've said so far and to make that decision. Okay, something wrong here. This is great. And so the fruits of the Spirit are peace, joy, meekness, mildness, kindness. The fruits of the evil spirit, the fruits of that which is not of God, is dissension, hatred, animosity, all those downsides of human nature. Through original sin, I talked about this before, I think. Through original sin, we're all wounded. Baptism, we'll talk about when we come to baptism, but baptism is a sacrament that takes away original sin, but certainly not the effects of it. And so all of us then have a tendency to be subject to temptation. We can easily be tempted, and we find ourselves at times falling, and so that's the effects of original sin that we sometimes gladly go along with by contributing our own sins to the murky pool that's there. And so all of us are in need of a Savior. We're in need of some way in which we can get out of some of the situations we get ourselves into. So living the moral life is, and turning to the one who's come to save us, that's how it all fits together. Beatitudes, like I mentioned, are at the heart of Jesus' preaching, and with all the paradoxes that are there, and the promises of ultimate resolution, ultimate joy, ultimate peace. The human person and freedom, the whole concept of freedom, and what John Paul, and this is part of what John Paul was talking about, it's very different than what we would hear on a news broadcast about people being free. His understanding of freedom springs out of the gospel, and it's very different than what we hear oftentimes. Because sometimes when we hear about freedom, freedom means I can do whatever I want to do. You know, I am free. I can do what I want to do, and that sounds kind of interesting and enticing, but it's not true. It's not the way things truly are. Freedom is a power, a capacity that we have that's rooted in our ability to reason, to think. It's rooted in our will, the ability to make a decision. Even though I might not feel good about it, I make a decision. To act or not act, to do this or to do that, to do something deliberately. And in making that kind of decision, then I have to accept responsibility for that. So freedom is the power that we have to go this way or that way, and then we have to accept responsibility for it. Exercising our freedom in a way that the scriptures would indicate that we should means that we are using the free will that God gives us, and we're shaping our lives in a way that is faithful to the fact that our Creator has given us this life and ask us to mold our life with our own particular gifts and talents in the shape that He wants us to do. Make sense? So, I mean, I think that's what's there. And so, our free will, the decisions we make day by day, that shapes our life. And if we don't bind our exercise of our free will to the person of Christ, then that's what we call sin, is we move away from the Lord and choose that which is not of God. And I think we know this. We have this experience. The more one does what is good, the freer we become. So think about any bad habit that can plague us. Any bad habit at all. Any one of the 7 capital sins. Think about it. And the more we do that which is good, the freer we become of that habit that could be bad. And the more we give into that habit, the more enslaved we become. Make sense? And so, I think one of the great gifts of our culture today is the 12-step program, because it deals with this kind of stuff of dealing with people trying to exercise their freedom in a way that brings them life. And so the more we do that which is good, the freer we become. The more we do that which is not of God, the more enslaved we become to whatever particular issue we're talking about. So that's what we call the slavery of sin, that we get caught. And St. Paul speaks about that. You know, he asks the question, why do I do what I don't want to do? Is that right? Why do I not do what I want to do? That's what I'm trying to say. You know what I'm talking about, that passage. And when he speaks about he can't figure out why that thorn in his flesh is there, why he can't get over it, why he can't move in the right direction. You know, that he's speaking about this, the slavery of whatever it is. And the point he's making is, I am weak, but if I turn to the one who is the way, the truth, and the life, then I become strong. Not by my own willpower, but by God's grace in me. And so, human history, the history of this day across the world, attests to the fact that suffering, oppression, violence, hatred, animosity, all of that results in, all that is an abuse of freedom and results in people being enslaved, either literally or figuratively from within their heart. But responding to God's grace is what gives us a sense of freedom, a sense of peace. Sin is the opposite of walking in a path towards God. And sin has different definitions. One is an utterance, a deed, a desire that's contrary to the eternal law. St. Augustine said that. It's an offense against God. It's an act contrary to reason. It wounds man's nature and enters human relationships. So I think sometimes about, parents working with their children. And many of you are parents. And I would have to believe that there are times when you say to your child, especially if that child is an older young child or a teenager, you know, what you're doing doesn't make any sense. Why are you doing this? It doesn't make sense. It's not reasonable. You know, it's not helping you. Oh, but I like to do it. I like this. Well, no, it's not reasonable. It doesn't help you. And I think that's a very basic principle that the Lord would say to each of us, that whatever our issues may be, whatever sins we may have, the Lord would be saying, you know, what you're doing doesn't make any sense. And the reason it doesn't make sense is because it's taking a beautiful work of art and throwing some acidic material up against it. That would make no sense. But we can treat ourselves in that way as human persons, that we are works of art, and we can destroy that work of art by giving into our experience of slavery. So the bottom line here is that we need a Savior. And Jesus is the one who says to us, I'm the way, the truth, and life. I'm the source of strength for your living a moral life. And so, from the Catholic Church's perspective, we have
different kinds of sins. Original sin I talked about. Personal sin is the sin that we're responsible for. There's also a sense of a social sin, a structural sin, that's kind of built into the institutions. And so certainly in our country, over the 200 years, whatever, 250 years, slavery, racism and we're certainly not the only country in the world that has this issue. But what I'm saying is that's part of the fabric of who it's built into our structures, our system, and we're trying to separate ourselves from that. But there are many other kinds of structural sin. And again, I mentioned a while ago, the Pope keeps kind of nudging us, jabbing us, encouraging us, especially those of us in the Western world, the first world nations. Hey, be careful that you're not getting greedy, that you're not trying to control it all, that you're not trying to take it all. Because all of us have dignity. Everybody on the planet has the right to life and the pursuit of happiness. So there are different kinds of sins that are there. The church also helps us, I think, in terms of understanding what sin is and what it does to us. So it evaluates sins according to their gravity. And so there are some areas of walking away from the Lord. Again, that's what sin is moving in the wrong direction. Sometimes the church would label some sins as venial. Venial is a Latin word that means lesser. So there's smaller things. The church also would caution us about sins that would be considered mortal or very, very serious. And mortal comes from a Latin word mors, which means death. So mortal sin is an action, an attitude, a pattern of life that deals death to our relationship with the Lord and has a serious effect upon others about us. St. Augustine used an analogy that I think makes a lot of sense, and that is trying to explain the difference between mortal and venial sin. This is hundreds and hundreds of years ago. But he says that in a marriage relationship, that the act of a squabble, a disagreement, a falling out temporarily, I'm not going to speak to you today, that kind of thing. You know, those would be considered lesser offenses, true? And I mean, sometimes it can be very, very human and very, very close to normal. And so that would be a lesser offense to the marriage. You know it's not healthy. You know this isn't the way I'm supposed to be. This doesn't make sense. But this is the way I want to behave. But it's not going to destroy your relationship. It's not going to destroy your marriage. You know, it's just irritation, either because you're put out with yourself because you can't deal with it, or you put out with your spouse because of whatever. So St. Augustine talks about the smaller things that can get in the way of the relationship, that don't help the relationship at all, that doesn't destroy it. Adultery, on the other hand, would have the possibility of destroying that marriage. So he talks about the two different ways in which some things are much more grave than the other. Now, he cautions too, the church over the years has cautioned that the repetition of lesser sins, of venial sins, doesn't get us anywhere. Because what happens is that habits get developed within us. And like with any habit, it can be here, then the habit gets a little bit worse, and all of a sudden you realize, oh my gosh, I have ruptured the relationship. You realize this is very serious. And so venial sins can lead us in a path that we don't want to go. So that's the value. We'll talk about this down the road a little bit, the sacrament of reconciliation, being transparent before the Lord, coming to the Lord as we are, and asking for His love and forgiveness, all of that. And so the church would look at, those are those distinctions that are there in terms of sin. All of this means that we need the Lord in our life. We need to realize, going back to what I said at the very beginning, is one opinion as good as another? I think that when it comes to moral principles, I think there's a wisdom in what Christianity, in Judaism, and then more specifically, the Catholic tradition offers us in terms of how to live. And so I think there's a great wisdom that we can tap into by absorbing those basic principles that are there. In the same way that, again, if we are physically ill, we're going to try to tap into the wisdom of physicians and nurse practitioners and people who know what they're doing to help us get well. So I think there's some basic principles there. So the moral teaching of the church is not a group of people who sat around the table and said, well, let's make up some rules that get people to follow. But rather it is, this is what Scripture tells us. This is what 2,000 years of tradition tell us. This is what the human experience tells us. And this is what Jesus Christ tells us. Now let's put it together and try to give us some guidelines, some principles by which we can make our moral decisions. And I think that's how it all fits together. Anyway, like I said at the beginning, it's another one of those topics that is very broad. But these are some basic aspects of morality from a Catholic perspective. I'm hesitant to even ask you if you have questions because I'm afraid Janet and the others will shoot me because they've got things for you to do after this. But are there any particular questions? All right. So we're completely settled on morality. We got it all figured out. All right. I'm going to call the bishop and tell him, Bishop, you got it figured out. Okay, Janet, where are you? There you are. Okay, thank you all.